In 1977, a television production quietly emerged that would reshape how millions of people imagined the life of Jesus. Directed by Franco Zeffirelli and starring Robert Powell, the mini-series Jesus of Nazareth was not simply another religious film. It became something far more enduring, a cinematic experience that blended historical storytelling with an atmosphere many viewers described as deeply spiritual. Over time, the film developed a reputation that went beyond its impressive production scale and legendary cast. Actors, crew members, and viewers alike began sharing stories about unusual moments during filming, times when the set grew unexpectedly silent, when scenes felt less like acting and more like witnessing sacred history. Nearly half a century later, those behind-the-scenes accounts continue to fascinate audiences. Some interpret them as coincidence. Others see something more profound. What truly happened during the making of this remarkable film, and why does its spiritual legacy still resonate today? The unusual spiritual atmosphere on the set of Jesus of Nazareth. When the production of Jesus of Nazareth began in the mid-1970s, few people expected it to become one of the most spiritually influential film projects ever created. The director, Franco Zeffirelli, was already a respected figure in world cinema, known for combining visual beauty with deep emotional storytelling. Yet even he later admitted that the filming of this project felt different from anything he had experienced before.
Look, they do it. They are going to make a big film for television, 6 hours, on the story of Jesus. It's important to all of us. Also was a ground for great uncertainty and fear.
From the earliest days of production, many members of the cast and crew described an atmosphere on set that was unusually quiet and reflective. Filming took place primarily in Tunisia and Morocco, where desert landscapes were transformed into ancient Judea. The natural environment already carried a sense of timelessness. Endless stretches of sand, ancient stone villages, and sunlight that seemed to echo the imagery many people associate with the biblical world. But something else seemed to happen as the filming progressed. Several actors later recalled that the mood on set often shifted when scenes involving Jesus were about to begin. Conversations would gradually fade. Crew members who had been laughing or talking moments earlier would suddenly lower their voices. It was not something anyone officially instructed them to do. The change appeared almost instinctive. Many extras, some of whom were local residents hired to populate the crowds in Jerusalem scenes, reportedly reacted in a similar way. When the actor portraying Jesus appeared in costume, people sometimes stopped what they were doing and watched quietly. For a moment, the boundaries between performance and devotion seemed to blur. At the center of this unusual atmosphere was the actor who carried the responsibility of portraying Christ, Robert Powell. The transformation of Robert Powell. Robert Powell was not the most obvious choice for the role. At the time, he was a relatively young British actor who had appeared in several television productions but was not internationally famous. In fact, the production team initially considered several more recognizable actors for the part. Ultimately, however, the director chose Powell precisely because audiences would not associate him with any previous role. Zeffirelli wanted viewers to see Jesus, not a celebrity. Powell understood the weight of the role immediately. In interviews years later, he explained that portraying Jesus required more than memorizing lines or performing dramatic gestures. The character carried immense spiritual meaning for millions of people.
I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe that somebody existed called Jesus Christ who was probably...
The actor knew that every expression, every pause, and every movement would shape how audiences imagined Christ. To prepare, Powell adopted a highly disciplined approach. He studied the Gospels extensively, not only to understand the words of Jesus, but also the tone in which those words might have been spoken. Rather than portraying Jesus as distant or theatrical, Powell wanted to convey calm authority, someone whose presence alone could command attention. One of the most striking elements of his performance became the intense gaze that audiences still remember decades later. Powell worked with the director to create a visual style that emphasized Jesus' eyes. Close-up shots were used frequently, allowing the camera to capture subtle shifts in expression. Lighting was carefully arranged so that the eyes appeared luminous against the desert landscape. The result was a portrayal that many viewers described as almost hypnotic. There was also a practical technique behind it. Powell practiced keeping his eyes open longer than normal during scenes. The director encouraged him to blink as little as possible so that the gaze of Jesus would appear unwavering. On screen, The effect created the impression that Christ was looking directly into the soul of the viewer. This small acting choice became one of the defining features of the entire series. Maintaining distance from the cast. Another unusual decision by Powell contributed to the spiritual tone of the production. Early in filming, he made a conscious effort to remain somewhat distant from the rest of the cast. This was not due to arrogance or personal preference. Powell explained that he wanted the actors playing the disciples to experience a certain sense of awe when interacting with Jesus on screen. If they spent every evening socializing casually, that sense of reverence might disappear. So during much of the filming, Powell limited his off-camera interaction with other actors. While the rest of the cast often gathered together after long shooting days, Powell frequently stayed alone, reviewing scripts or quietly preparing for the next day's scenes. Over time, this separation created an unexpected psychological effect. Some actors admitted that they began to feel a subtle distance between themselves and the actor portraying Christ, even though they understood it was intentional. When filming resumed each morning, the presence of Powell in costume felt different from ordinary conversation backstage. In a strange way, the acting method worked. The disciples' reactions on screen often appear genuinely respectful and attentive, as if they are listening to a teacher whose authority they instinctively recognize. The silence. Before filming, crew members also noticed another recurring phenomenon. Before certain major scenes, particularly moments when Jesus delivered sermons or performed miracles, the set would become unusually quiet. Normally, film productions are busy environments filled with technical instructions, equipment adjustments, and constant background movement. Yet during these scenes, the noise seemed to fade. Part of this quiet came from practical necessity. Microphones and cameras required controlled conditions. But many participants later said the silence felt deeper than ordinary technical discipline. It carried a kind of collective focus. Even people who were not religious sensed that the subject matter demanded respect. In interviews years later, several crew members described moments when they realized that hundreds of people were standing completely still, watching a scene unfold with a seriousness that felt closer to witnessing history than making entertainment. Filming in landscapes that felt biblical location also played an important role in shaping the spiritual mood of the production. The filmmakers chose regions of North Africa that visually resembled ancient Judea. Villages constructed from stone, winding desert paths, and dramatic hills provided natural backdrops for many scenes. Unlike studio sets built indoors, these locations allowed the actors to perform within vast open landscapes. When sunrise lit the desert hills or evening shadows stretched across the villages, the environment often looked strikingly similar to traditional biblical paintings. Actors later said that filming in these locations helped them emotionally connect with the story. Walking along dusty roads or standing on hills overlooking wide valleys made it easier to imagine how first-century life might have felt. For Robert Powell, these settings deepened his immersion in the role. Standing on a hillside delivering the Sermon on the Mount while hundreds of extras listened below, it created an experience that felt almost ceremonial. Even though everyone knew cameras were recording the scene, the scale and atmosphere sometimes made it feel less like acting and more like participating in a historical reenactment. The emotional weight of the story. Another factor that shaped the atmosphere was the emotional intensity of the narrative itself. The story of Jesus is not merely historical drama. It contains moments of compassion, suffering, betrayal, and sacrifice that resonate deeply with audiences around the world. As the production moved toward the later chapters of the gospel story, the emotional weight of the script became increasingly powerful. Actors portraying the disciples began filming scenes that depicted confusion, fear, and loyalty. Characters who had followed Jesus throughout the story now faced the possibility of losing him. By the time the production approached the passion sequences, the entire cast had spent months immersed in the biblical narrative. Relationships between characters had developed naturally through the filming process, making the final scenes feel emotionally authentic. Many participants later recalled that these moments were among the most intense experiences of their acting careers. A project treated with unusual respect. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the production was how seriously everyone involved treated the material. From costume designers to lighting technicians, the crew approached the project with a sense that they were participating in something meaningful. Sets were constructed with historical detail, costumes reflected research into ancient clothing, and dialogue was carefully written to balance scriptural language with dramatic storytelling. Director Franco Zeffirelli also consulted scholars from different religious traditions to ensure the story respected its historical context. This included Christian theologians, Jewish scholars, and experts familiar with Middle Eastern culture. The goal was not to produce a purely devotional film, but to present the life of Jesus with authenticity and dignity. That commitment to authenticity contributed significantly to the atmosphere people later described as spiritual. When hundreds of individuals focus their creative energy on telling a story that has shaped human history for 2,000 years, the process itself can begin to feel extraordinary. When acting feels like witnessing. As filming continued, many participants began to sense that something unique was happening. Of course, there were still the ordinary challenges of filmmaking: equipment failures, scheduling difficulties, and the long hours typical of large productions. Yet beneath those practical realities lay a feeling that the project carried unusual significance. For Robert Powell, the role became inseparable from his public identity. Even decades later, audiences around the world still recognize him as the face of Jesus from the 1977 series. That enduring connection suggests that the film captured something rare, a portrayal of Christ that felt authentic not only because of careful storytelling, but also because of the atmosphere in which it was created. The spiritual tone did not come from special effects or dramatic music alone. It emerged from the collective attitude of the people making the film. Actors, crew members, and extras who treated the story with reverence. And as production moved toward the most dramatic scenes of the Passion, that atmosphere would intensify even further. As the production of Jesus of Nazareth moved into the final phase of filming, the atmosphere that had quietly developed over months on set reached its most intense point. The scenes depicting the suffering and crucifixion of Jesus were not simply another sequence in the script. For many actors and crew members, they became the emotional center of the entire production. By this stage, the cast had spent months living within the story. The relationships between characters had been built scene by scene, through sermons, journeys, miracles, and moments of quiet conversation among the disciples. James Earl Jones, Balthazar. To give the Nativity story a sense of majestic gravity, the series included one of cinema's most commanding presences, James Earl Jones. He portrayed Balthazar, one of the Magi, and his role became far more than a brief appearance. It stood as a powerful symbol of representation and universality. Jones was the first black actor to portray one of the three wise men in a biblical production of this scale, sending a clear message that the Messiah came not for one people or region, but for all humanity. With his unmistakable deep voice, the same voice that would later define Darth Vader and King Mufasa, Jones infused the character with an ancient wisdom. Even with limited dialogue, each line carried the weight of prophecy. Raised in a religious environment, Jones always expressed deep respect for Jesus. To achieve this, he adopted a strict diet for several weeks before filming. By eating very little and reducing his body weight, he allowed his face and body to appear thinner and more exhausted. The goal was not simply visual realism, but emotional credibility. When audiences later watched the crucifixion scenes, they would see a man who looked genuinely weakened by suffering. Filming the scenes themselves required long hours under difficult conditions. Powell had to remain suspended on the cross while cameras captured multiple angles. Each shot required adjustments to lighting, camera placement, and actor positioning. What viewers eventually saw on screen as a few minutes of intense drama actually took many days to complete. Despite the technical complexity, the set often became unusually quiet during these moments. Crew members spoke softly. Extras who played members of the crowd stood silently between takes. The atmosphere resembled a solemn gathering more than a typical film set. One of the most frequently mentioned stories from the production involves the reactions of the extras present during the crucifixion scenes. Hundreds of people were hired to portray onlookers in Jerusalem, soldiers, citizens, and followers of Jesus who witnessed the execution. Many of these individuals were local residents with little acting experience. They had been brought to the set simply to fill the background of large crowd scenes. But when filming began, something unexpected happened. As the scene unfolded, with Jesus suspended on the cross, Roman soldiers standing nearby, and the disciples watching in grief, some of the extras reportedly became deeply emotional. A number of them began to cry during the takes. At first, the director assumed that these reactions were part of the performance. After all, the script called for expressions of sorrow and shock among the crowd. However, it soon became clear that many of the extras were not acting. Several participants later explained that the realism of the moment affected them strongly. Standing only a short distance away from the cross, watching the scene unfold against the stark desert sky, they felt as if they were witnessing something historical rather than fictional. Even though everyone knew it was a film, the emotional intensity of the scene blurred the line between performance and reality. The reactions were not limited to the extras. Members of the technical crew, people responsible for cameras, lighting, and equipment, also described a noticeable shift in the atmosphere during these scenes. Normally, filmmaking requires constant movement. Technicians adjust equipment, assistants carry cables across the set, and directors give instructions loudly enough to be heard above the background noise. Yet during the crucifixion sequences, many crew members instinctively lowered their voices or stopped speaking altogether. Some later said they felt reluctant to interrupt the scene even when the cameras were not rolling. Part of this silence may have come from simple respect for the subject matter. The crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most powerful narratives in human history, and many people, religious or not, recognize its emotional gravity. But several participants suggested that the atmosphere felt deeper than ordinary respect. For a moment, the set felt almost sacred. Director Franco Zeffirelli later reflected on these scenes in interviews. He explained that his goal had always been to present the life of Jesus in a way that felt real rather than theatrical. Unlike earlier biblical films that relied heavily on dramatic gestures and elaborate sets, Zeffirelli wanted his version to feel grounded in human experience. This approach meant focusing on subtle expressions and emotional authenticity rather than spectacle. During the crucifixion scenes, that realism reached its peak. The dusty wind blowing across the hill, the stillness of the watching crowd, and the quiet suffering portrayed by Powell created an atmosphere that many participants found deeply moving. For a few minutes, it seemed possible to forget that cameras and microphones surrounded the scene. What remained was simply the story. The emotional impact of the passion scenes did not end when filming concluded. Several actors later said that working on the production affected them personally. Portraying characters who witnessed the suffering of Jesus required the cast to immerse themselves in the emotional world of the gospel narrative. For some, this experience left a lasting impression. Actors who played the disciples often described the final scenes as particularly powerful. After spending months portraying followers who walked beside Jesus throughout his ministry, the moment of crucifixion felt like the loss of someone they had come to know. Even though the relationships existed only within the script, the long production schedule allowed the actors to inhabit their roles deeply. This emotional investment made the final scenes feel genuine rather than staged. Another factor contributing to the intensity of the filming was the awareness that the story carried enormous significance for millions of viewers. The life of Jesus is not simply historical material. It forms the foundation of Christian faith. For many people, the events portrayed in the film are sacred memories passed down through generations. The cast and crew understood that their work would be watched by audiences around the world, including individuals for whom the story was deeply personal. This awareness created a sense of responsibility. Actors often discuss the importance of portraying the characters with dignity and authenticity. The goal was not to create sensational drama, but to communicate the humanity of the people involved. In many ways, this commitment shaped the tone of the entire production. By the time the crucifixion scenes were complete, many participants felt that the experience had been different from any other film project. Some describe moments of quiet reflection between takes, when individuals stood looking across the desert landscape without speaking. Others remembered conversations among cast members about the meaning of the story they had just reenacted. These moments did not involve dramatic or supernatural events. Instead, they reflected a shared awareness that the production had touched something profound. For a brief period, hundreds of people from different cultures and backgrounds had come together to recreate one of the most influential stories in human history. And in doing so, they discovered that the process itself could be deeply moving. When Jesus of Nazareth was finally released, audiences around the world responded strongly to the passion sequences. Many viewers described them as among the most powerful portrayals of the crucifixion ever filmed. Part of that impact came from the visual realism and careful storytelling, but another part likely came from the atmosphere in which the scenes had been created. The respect, focus, and emotional investment of the cast and crew shaped the final result in ways that cannot easily be measured. Nearly 50 years later, these scenes continue to move viewers who watch the film during Easter or encounter it for the first time. And the stories told by those who were present during filming offer a glimpse into why the experience felt so extraordinary. Nearly 50 years later, Jesus of Nazareth still holds a unique place in the history of biblical cinema. Many films about Jesus have been made since then, but few have combined historical seriousness, restrained storytelling, and spiritual atmosphere with the same balance. The careful direction of Franco Zeffirelli and the disciplined performance of Robert Powell created something that continues to feel authentic rather than theatrical. In my view, the most interesting aspect of this production is not whether unusual events occurred during filming. It is the collective mindset of the people involved. When actors and crew treat a story with genuine respect, that attitude becomes visible on screen. The emotional reactions described by participants suggest that the production environment encouraged reflection rather than spectacle. That may explain why audiences still respond to the film decades later. The series does not attempt to overwhelm viewers with dramatic effects. Instead, it invites quiet attention. But this raises an important question for us today. Why does this portrayal of Jesus continue to resonate while many modern productions fade quickly? Is it because of the performance, the directing style, or the sincerity behind the project? And perhaps the most interesting question is this: when viewers feel something deeply spiritual while watching a film, is that the result of storytelling alone, or does it reveal something about the enduring power of the story itself? Subscribe to the Following Christ channel to watch fascinating videos about Jesus. May God bless you.